and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. We're excited to be back here with you today for day 2 of the Handshake Access 2021 conference. So excited to welcome you all this morning with a wonderful keynote from our speaker, Lindsey Pollak. We're going to go through a little bit of housekeeping as everybody continues to stream into the room. So we'll do that first, and then Lindsey and I will get into our fireside chat and our conversation about how we can all recalculate, both ourselves as career educators as well as in the service of all of our students. So first, let's actually go through a little bit of housekeeping for those that perhaps did not attend as many sessions yesterday and just need a little bit of a refresher. So if you have questions or comments, you don't need to wait. Please feel free to go ahead and send those in while we're chatting. We have a Q&A box, as you can see in the diagram here. So please continue to send all of your questions in there. And as participants, you can upvote your colleagues' questions. So go ahead and do that as well. We have a whole team of folks on the back end that are compiling all of those, and we'll be sending that over to Lindsey and I so that we can answer that at the very end of our session today. If you are interested in interacting with other attendees, which we certainly encourage you to do, please feel free to also message in these sessions. If you use Stage, that will stay in this session for Lindsey and I. If you use General, that will actually go out to the entire conference-wide discussion board. So just keep in mind the difference between Stage is us, and the difference for General is everybody at the conference. But we hope you will stay engaged. There was so much good energy yesterday. I know there was a lot of sharing. Don't hesitate to do that and to make sure that you're also connecting with each other while we chat today. All right. With that, let's go ahead and actually share a little bit about Lindsey and Lindsey's book. So first, I'm going to invite Lindsey to unmute herself ever so briefly and just introduce herself. Many of you already know her. She almost needs no introduction. She is our career and workplace expert. She has specialized in generational differences for quite some time. I know many of us have been referring to her work as we thought about millennials, and now we are referring to her work as we think about the shift to Generation Z and what that looks like as the workforce continues to evolve and change. So Lindsey, where are you calling in from today?
Hi, Christine. I'm so happy to be here. Career Services, you are my people. I started my career as an RA and a tour guide. As I know many of you did, I always shout out my fellow RAs, and I owe my whole career to Career Services. I am normally in New York City, but I'm dialing in today from West Cornwall, Connecticut. And I just want to point out, because I'm staring at our headshots, Christine, that during the pandemic, I had some changes. One is my hair got really dark and I got glasses. So that is what happened to me since COVID, but I could not be more delighted to be here. So thanks for having me.
I love that. And that also reminds me that I need a new headshot. So we can all get new pictures after our conference. Wonderful. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Christine Cruzvergara. I'm the Chief Education Strategy Officer here at Handshake, and excited to host Lindsey today. Now, for those of you that don't know, Lindsey has just written a new book. Her new book is called Recalculating, which we are going to be talking about today. And as I mentioned in my welcome yesterday, is really the basis and sort of theme that has run throughout many of our sessions as we think about this new opportunity that is upon us and how we continue to recalculate and rethink who we are, how we do our work, and how we serve our students. So 200 lucky attendees in today's session will win a free copy of Lindsey's new book. We will let you know next week. Winners will be notified next week via email, and we will send that off to you. So get excited to read her new work. It's really terrific and very, very similar in some ways to her previous books, in that there's tangible techniques and strategies and things that you can immediately apply. But there's also some other aspects that I know Lindsey's actually going to talk about today that are a little bit different in how she wrote Recalculating from her previous books as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the conversation. So Lindsey, thank you again for joining us. We're really excited to have you here. I thought I would really just kind of jump right in. You talk about 5 steps for recalculating in your book. Could you sort of just briefly and broadly introduce what those 5 steps are for folks that have not had a chance to read Recalculating yet?
Yeah, and thank you for the giveaway. That's so exciting. The title is exactly what everyone pictures when you say the word recalculating. When the pandemic hit, like everybody, I was kind of blindsided, and I looked out the window of my apartment in New York City and just had this moment of that time when you're in your car and you take a wrong turn or you hit traffic and your GPS says recalculating. You didn't do anything wrong, right? It just happens. And suddenly you can't go the way you wanted to go anymore. And it happened to me personally. You all know me. I'm a professional speaker. I went from a fully booked calendar to a completely empty calendar in a 2-week period. And it was absolutely terrifying. And the way I process that is I write about it and I call and interview people. Christine, you're in the book. And when I started to interview people about how they were handling this situation, it got to a deeper issue, which is how to handle change at all, which is something that we all go through. And the reason recalculating is, an active activity is that when I started to talk about people about how they handle it, it's not that you hit a crossroads and go left or right. It's that you're constantly pivoting and you're constantly looking at what's around you and sort of altering to that mindset. And so when I think about the position that we're all in, it's not go left or right. It's about how do I pivot all the time to make sure that I stay relevant. So in the book, I have 5 steps to do that. Should I go through them really quickly? So step 1 of doing that, of kind of constantly pivoting, is to embrace creativity, which is if you keep doing what you know how to do, you're never going to change. So embrace your curiosity. Embrace your desire to learn about new things. You're going to have to try different stuff. I always said I would never coach. And during the pandemic, I said, well, might as well try coaching. I've never done it before. Speaking is not an option. For our students, we would say, oh, you want to go into marketing? Have you thought about these other 17 fields that are related to marketing? You're going to have to get creative. So number 1 is to make sure that you're expanding your horizons, casting a wider net. Number 2 is prioritize action. There was such a paralysis, I think, that people felt when COVID started. And I see it among students. And I did this myself when I graduated from college, which is, well, nobody's telling me what to do. And what do I do? And I think that a lot of people, interestingly, as I've been promoting the book, I was used to getting a lot of really tactical questions. What do I put on my resume? What do I say in a career? And with this book, the number 1 question I've gotten is, how do I stay motivated when it's just so hard? And, I just don't know what to do. And the only answer is take one little step every day. So if you prioritize even the tiniest action over time is going to build momentum. So what I say to students is get out of your head and get onto your to-do list, right? Stop thinking and start acting. So that's number 2. Number 3 is the hardest for me because I am a card-carrying control freak, which is focus on controlling what you can. We cannot control the virus. We cannot control if our employers want us back in the office or not. You can't control if an employer hires you or rejects you. So focus on what you can control, which is your work ethic, which is showing up on time for the interview, which is reaching out to 3 people a day on LinkedIn. So really focusing on your locus of control. And students found that very empowering to realize that you just can't think about all those other factors. Even older workers who said, what if I'm too old? Well, you can't control that. Whether someone has ageism, you can only control your activities. Number 4 is to know your non-negotiables, which is what actually matters to you. Do you need flexibility? Do you need a certain salary? Do you need to work with people or on issues that you care about? I think that a lot of people have had to compromise, and a lot of people are going to have to compromise, but you don't have to compromise on everything. So what are the areas where you will not compromise so that you can maybe bend on other issues? And the 5th and final one is probably actually the first thing that I did and something that I feel really strongly about, which is ask for help. And I know some of you know me from my old days when I was a spokesperson for LinkedIn a million years ago. And I remember Reid Hoffman, one of the founders of LinkedIn, he said, I think people use LinkedIn wrong. He said, I think people go into LinkedIn and say, what can I get from LinkedIn? And he said, the way he tries to use, what can I give to people? And I think that people, especially in the early days of the pandemic and continuing, I think really want to help other people. And whether you were laid off or you feel like you don't know something about a topic, there's sort of an inherent shame sometimes about admitting you need help. And I think because we all needed help during the pandemic, some of that went away. And so I hope we keep that willingness to say, you know what, I need some ideas, I need some help. And I really tried to embrace that. And I think it's really what helped me kind of come out of the pandemic okay. And I think students who were willing to reach out to people and not kind of stay in their own little bubble were really successful. So rule number 5 is ask for help.
I love that, Lindsey. I love that. I'm going to try and actually summarize all of that for folks that might just be joining us right now. Lindsey has just gone through her 5 steps for recalculating. The first being be creative and be curious in whatever it is that sort of interests you. The second is to prioritize action. Don't let the paralysis, the decision paralysis sort of hit you. The third is focus on what you can control. Think about your locus of control. Think about your sphere of influence and allow that to help guide you. Know your non-negotiables, what you're not willing to sort of bend on. And lastly, be ready to ask for help. And I think those are so important. And when combined, I think there's so much power that we actually give ourselves in thinking about the future. So I really love that, Lindsey. Thank you for sort of kicking us off with that. Before we actually dive into each of those, one of the things I want to ask you is about mindset. So you actually spent the first part of your book talking about mindset. And as career educators, as we think about the pivots that need to happen not only on campuses and institutions, but for our students to prepare them for the rapidly changing world around, quite frankly, any industry that they want to go to, what message would you sort of share with folks about mindset? Why is that important? And what do they really need to be thinking about so that they can be better prepared to have a strong mindset going into these steps?
I was almost embarrassed when I started to write this book to realize how little I'd written about mindset in the past, because I would just die, right? Okay, here's what we need to do. And that was not an what it hit. I had to start with mindset. And everybody I interviewed, the first thing they said was, you got to believe it before it's going to happen. You have to believe it's possible to move forward. You have to know that you have some control here. And so the whole first chapter became about mindset. And not surprisingly to people in higher education, growth mindset is what I focused on, the work of Carol Dweck. And the idea of growth mindset, for those who aren't familiar, is a belief that you can get better at anything, right? And that a fixed mindset, I'm just not artistic, or I'm just not good at math, is not going to bring you to success. And so the piece of growth mindset that I really focused on, because I do like practical advice, is the gut, which is saying, I haven't figured out my career yet, right? I'm not good at technology yet, right? I haven't found a company that wants to hire people over 50 yet. And when you do that, it sort of opens up this world of possibilities. And so, I haven't found a way to replace my speaking business yet. It means that there are things out there. And so I think when you start from that, it gives people something to grab onto. I did hear from a lot of students who I interviewed who said, stop telling me it's going to be okay. Stop telling me I'm going to figure it out. I get that you mean well, but that's actually not helpful to me. So I always try to think about things like mindset in terms of how can I actually make that actionable so it helps somebody move forward with whatever it is they're trying to achieve.
I think that's so great. But Lindsey, what do you do if you are working with a student, or you have a colleague, or you have a team that maybe is just feeling so exhausted that they can't quite take on that positive mindset? They can't take on that growth mindset, or they're just not there yet. What do you do? How do you help to actually get them there?
So two thoughts come to mind. One is extreme empathy and transparency. I mean, the first thing I wanted to tell you today is like, wow, I lost all of my business in March of 2020. I've been there. So if you're struggling to figure out your career or how bad it was, I get it. I really get it. And I think of that project. I remember Stanford University had the Resilience Project, where these really eminent professors said, yeah, I failed my first physics test, right? Or I didn't pass my oral first time. So I think number one is vulnerability, and saying, or gathering people together to say, I'm not perfect. I've messed up too. The second thing I think is, whenever a student or anyone says, I can't, it's to say, what can you do? Right? Yeah. Can you wake up tomorrow half an hour earlier? Can you send one resume? What is one thing you're willing to commit to? And I really deeply believe, and I've seen it work, that momentum works. If you get someone to do one small thing, the next day they might be able to do a little bit more. So it's finding that little in when you can't. I also, finally, I think I'm a big fan of the buddy system, right? There was a group of people who got laid off from a company who told me they texted each other every day and said, hey, you up? What are you working on today? So I think a little bit of peer support can also be really powerful too.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I also want to think about that within the context, the mindset piece within the context of this past year that we've had. Lindsey, you and I have chatted certainly in a number of other conversations around the impact that 2020 has had on women, the impact that it has had on underrepresented groups, the impact that it has had for folks that may not be part of the majority or be part of systems or organizations that were sort of built for them, and how that has deep impact and sort of collective trauma over time for folks on their mindset. And then when you add sort of the pandemic, or you add what everybody has been going through, that can feel extremely heavy for a lot of folks. And to be able to actually talk through what that means and what the small nugget of what they can do might be is so critical as we think about those pieces. Are there certain stories or strategies or techniques that you have heard through all of your interviews for folks that maybe are professionals of color or women in male-dominated fields that have helped them sort of think about their mindset and still feel that they have the power and influence even within a construct that might not always respect that?
Yeah, I think about it a lot as a white woman, asking people I know who are in underrepresented groups, what should I be doing? What would actually be helpful? And certainly the work is on me to figure that out, but I've had a lot of people very generous share. And one of the things that I heard a lot, and I would love other people to weigh in, I'm certainly not an expert, is just check in and ask how I'm doing and give me the option to talk about it or the option not to talk about it. Don't force me, right? Don't assume I'm having a bad day because something happened in the news. Just give me the option. And so I think what that's translated as is checking in on people more than I might in the past, particularly people who work with me. And I think watching leaders are just more frequently checking in. And I think on a macro scale, I think organizations are creating spaces for these conversations to happen, but not forcing people to be part of them, but saying, here is a space that is always available to you. I'm going to keep checking on you, and I'm not going to force you into it. So I think there's a little bit of a balance there.
Yeah, definitely. So let's actually jump into a couple of your steps. I think they're so interesting, and I think there's a lot for us to kind of dig into. So one that I actually really want to kind of jump to is your number 4, around knowing your non-negotiables. How do you recommend folks think about their non-negotiables and identify what those might be, especially if they have certain constraints? Maybe they're the breadwinner for their family. Maybe they do not have the option of moving geographically somewhere else. Maybe they have certain constraints when it comes to their family life or who they might need to take care of. What does that sort of look like for you, and what you recommend around figuring out your non-negotiables to fit your values and what it is you want to do and be curious about, while also keeping in mind the constraints that your life may have that might actually not be changeable at the moment?
First thing that comes to, don't force yourself to have non-negotiables if you don't, right? So if you're 22 and you have a lot of options, don't sort of say, well, I have to figure out that I have non-negotiables, because you know what, maybe you're very flexible right now, and that's great. The others that you mentioned, I think you know it when you see it, which is I have to make a certain amount of money to pay my rent, or I have to be home at 3 o'clock to pick up my daughter. So I think when you know your non-negotiables, you're clear. And just to give a really simple example, I interviewed a young woman who had graduated with her bachelor's degree, and she needed to make money. She said, my number one goal is to make money, even more than starting a career in my dream field. Yeah. And so she got the only job she could at the time, which was working checkout at a grocery store, because she needed the money. And what she said was, I went into it with a positive attitude because I knew why I was taking the job. I knew I was doing it to make a salary. And she said, because of that, I knew it wasn't forever. And I went into it thinking, okay, how can I make the most of this? And what can I do? Because I'm getting my needs met, I can turn this into an opportunity. So she chit-chatted with everybody, and she was really positive, and she met people, and she made it an opportunity. And I think you can choose to say, well, I need the money, so I'm going to go in. Or you can say, all right, I'm doing this now for a very specific reason. Yeah. And I'm going to see the opportunity in that. I also am a really big fan, and many people know this, of taking some sort of assessment, whether it's through a career center. Many of you know I'm an ambassador for Capfinity. I like their strengths profile. Maybe it's a Myers-Briggs test, but a lot of students, I think, don't know where to focus. And I think a really simple assessment that says, here's some things about yourself that you might not be aware of. I even think taking a test to define yourself as introvert or extrovert. You know, I think I'm a very extroverted person, but I actually really do need alone time in my day. So when I've had jobs in like very open environments, it's very hard for me. And I didn't really realize that until I took an assessment that said, well, I'm a little bit closer to introvert than I thought. So I think in addition to kind of knowing yourself, taking some sort of assessment can be helpful to get at some of those topics.
Yeah, definitely. I think, Lindsey, everything that you just said kind of, again, surfaces and kind of goes back, it connects back to the theme of mindset that you were talking about, and the fact that we all have agency in our choice to be able to choose to see the positive, or to be able to choose to see what you might be able to learn from a situation that maybe even isn't always as ideal. Now, when we're working with students and folks are actually trying to advise their students on the rapidly changing world of work, on what is coming, on what is changing in ways that we don't even all necessarily know, what advice do you think is probably most critical for students to hear right now as they head into 2021, the rest of 2021, as they head into this future where many companies are actually trying to figure out exactly what it's going to look like? What do you think is most critical for career educators to be relaying?
I'm a little embarrassed, because this advice I gave in 2007 in my book, Getting from College to Career. And I want to credit, I don't know if she's watching, but Michelle Horton of Wake Forest University gave this quote for Recalculating, which is, stop focusing on what is going to be important 10 years from now, the jobs of the future. Focus on the jobs of today, right? And I remember, tell me if any of my fellow Gen Xers remember this, but I remember in the 1980s, everybody said everyone who really is thinking about the future needs to learn Japanese, because Japan is going to be the economy of the future, and any young person who knows Japanese is going to thrive. We did not know that Japan was on the cusp of a lost decade of economic, disaster, and we were wrong. So all the kids, it's wonderful to learn Japanese, it's a wonderful country, but that was not the right prediction. So don't worry much about the jobs of the next 50 years or the next 20 years, and think about what employers looking for today, right? Handshake put out data of here's who's hiring right now. And so what that means to me, the advice I was saying I gave in 2007 is read the news, right? What's going on right now? Who's thriving right now? And where I think sometimes students miss it, I think this is really important, and I heard it in your conversation yesterday with Paul, there's a difference between industry and job function. So I remember when Handshake and LinkedIn had that hashtag, hiring now, who's hiring right now? It was grocery stores, it was logistics companies. That didn't mean, like the woman I just described, that you had to work at a checkout. Grocery stores have jobs in HR and in accounting and in marketing and in logistics. It's not just the job that you've heard of. A lot of these industries have jobs. So an industry can have growth, but you can still find a job in PR for high growth industry. I think sometimes miss that. I think it's important to follow the trends of today. And frankly, while institutions have to think about jobs of the next 20 years, I'm not sure that a college senior needs to do that.
Yeah, that's really great advice. I think focusing on the now, focusing on how you can pivot, how you can apply, be agile with those particular skills, I think is excellent. Now, one of the things that I know you have also mentioned, I'd love for you to kind of go into this a little bit further, is the idea of turn any job into a great job. You've already kind of mentioned that a few times in our conversations ever so lightly, but I would love for you to really hone in on that. Too often, I think the advice for students is find what you're passionate about. And I think I'm the first to often say to people, not only is that extremely overwhelming for a lot of folks, even full-grown adults, not knowing necessarily what their passion is, but it's an extremely privileged way of thinking. Not everybody has the privilege to think about what it is they are passionate about and then to pursue that or turn that into a career. So tell us a little bit about your perspective and what you also write about in terms of turn any job into a dream job.
Yeah, I really changed my advice on this too, Christine, partly because of the privilege issue. I used to talk about dream jobs and dream careers all the time. I've completely stopped. I actually just called out on LinkedIn because I accidentally did it once a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, be careful what you say on LinkedIn. So not only is it a privileged position, but when I graduated from grad school, I got my dream job. I worked for Working Women magazine in the brand new .com division. It was literally my dream job. I had a master's degree in women's studies. It was in New York City where I wanted to be. It was a really cool .com job. And guess what? The company went bankrupt. So I had it and it went away. And I was more devastated because I thought it was my dream job. So I think we set ourselves up with these unrealistic expectations that every day, if you find your dream job, it's going to be perfect. And so I think it's an expectation mismatch, which is nothing is perfect. I love the work that I do, but am I happy every day? Of course not. That's unrealistic. And so I think if we lower the bar and say, look, whatever job I'm in right now, kind of like the woman who had the checkout job, what can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? What can I get out of this situation? How can I thrive and perform my best while learning from this situation? Then you have a very different approach to the job. So the chapter in any job into a great job is, okay, there are probably going to be things you don't like. But what are you going to get out of this? Maybe I'm going to meet people. I'm going to network. I'm going to learn a new skill. Maybe what I'm going to get out of this job is realizing I never want to have a job like this or a boss like this ever again. And now I know to look out for that. So I think we have a lot more control than we think. Control what you can again, which is, all right, this isn't perfect. What am I going to do to make this as great as it could be? And frankly, to career services professionals who feel like they're not as respected in their university or they're worried about the future of the career, okay, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to turn this particular situation into an opportunity for growth for our field, but also for your own career? I think we have more control over that than we tend to admit.
I love that. And we are definitely going to go down that road. I want to take that rabbit hole and we're going to go explore that for a second. But one of the things, just to finish off this piece about students and sort of dream jobs and dispelling that myth, one of the things I actually love from one of the faculty members I worked at Wellesley was she often told students, there will be a part of your job that you are not going to like. There will be some percentage of time or some task that you don't like. And when you have those moments, remember, that's why you're getting paid, right? Like and I'll just pause there for a second. It's why you're getting paid. You're not doing this for free. You are getting paid. So there will be parts of your job that you don't love. And that was always really interesting because I could literally see when she said this to her classes or she said this to students that we were talking to or leaders, there was always this little bit of a light bulb that sort of went off for the students when they were like, oh, right, of course. I don't have to love every single aspect. And it almost felt freeing to a lot of students in being able to take off that heavy expectation of it has to be perfect. It has to be exactly what I want, so on and so forth. And so I really love that. So thank you for, I think, reminding all of us that students can take those opportunities to learn. They can take it to be curious. They can take it to find what it is they're interested in. And honestly, I think many of us on this call, quite frankly, at 5, 10, 15, maybe even 20 years old, we're not saying, my dream job is to be a career educator. That's what I want to do one day, right? It was something that we ended up falling into or we ended up discovering. And for many of us, we do love it now, but it wasn't something that we always knew right from the beginning. So to pivot back to the point that you made at the very end around we probably have more control and more influence and more power than we think we do, or that we think we might sort of give credence to. I would love for you to kind of tell us more about what you see. You have a very different vantage point in your role and your position. You talk to thousands of schools. You talk to millions of students. You talk to many senior administrators or faculty in addition to career educators. As you look at the landscape, I know you said you listened to our conversation with Paul yesterday. As you look at the landscape of our world right now, and you look at the landscape of higher education, the conversation around return on investment, the call that I feel like is imperative around getting career educators and career education a seat at the table. What are 1 or 2 or 3 things that you think our colleagues listening today actually have a lot of influence over and that they could start to either position themselves or do as soon as they finish this conference?
It's such a good question. And I do have a really unique position in this world, which is I talk to a lot of you. And I wish you talked to each other more. And I think you're doing it. I'm sorry, my side eye. I can't help but watch the chat as we're talking. There is so much wisdom, and none of you are competitive with each other. So I think that there are so many career services professionals who are doing amazingly innovative, creative things, getting the seat at the table, as you talked about, really being creative. There's no reason that you couldn't share those ideas with people at other institutions so that they can implement them too. I just interviewed a guy named Vince Baum from Synchrony, which is a financial services company. And he said, I'm a recruiter and I want to improve my DEI results. I'm telling everybody what I'm doing, because if I come up with a good idea, I want you to do it too. And so I think number one is sort of idea sharing among the industry. And we do it at Handshake events, we do it at NACE events, et cetera. But I think it's sort of steal ideas from what other people are doing, implement them, because there's some really good ones. The second thing, I want to take your comment about seat at the table very literally. Where can you go sit at tables, right? People say, well, faculty doesn't want to talk. I bet there's some faculty who would. So find them and take them out to lunch. I know people who go sit on the committee of every single employee resource group at their university to make those relationships, right? They go to the sporting events to meet the coaches, right? You can't necessarily invite yourself to the, board of trustees meeting, but I bet there are more people that you can connect with and build those relationships so you have it. And I know that I'm putting the burden on the career services professionals, but sometimes we have to acknowledge that we have to do the hard work, right? And be entrepreneurial. So I think it's about really expanding our view of what's possible and not waiting for people to realize how amazing we are in career services, but sort of to go and say, hey, there's an employability crisis in this country, right? There's a huge conversation about ROI. This is career services moment to walk in and say, I know what to do about that. I have some volunteer for et cetera. And I think that there's a lot of power in that. I'll stop because I think there are a lot of other things we can do, but I think it's kind of like old-fashioned networking is maybe a first step that I'm really advocating for, which is start to know more people and sit at more tables, whether you're invited or not.
I think that's great. And it really reminds me a lot of the change that I've led at different institutions. The reality is it's never easy, right? Like the majority of people want to stay status quo. The majority of institutions, as much as they might talk about change, they might talk about innovation, it is actually difficult to get folks out of the mode of whatever they are already used to. And I think what you've just noted are some really small, tangible steps that actually collectively can make a really big difference. If you're not getting top-down support, start using a grassroots effort. Figure out and segment your audience to figure out who are champions, who are sort of on the fence, and who might be dissenters. And within that dissenter sort of category, who's actually influential. And as you start to build those smaller relationships outside of the more formal meetings, you will be able to build the types of relationships you need to be able to get the credibility, the buy-in, and to start to move. And sometimes that does take time, but the earlier you start, the more you'll be able to do that. And I think that's really great. And no worries about looking at the chat. I'm also looking at it too. I want to make sure that we're able to actually connect to everybody's ideas and thoughts. And actually, Lindsey, we have a few questions that have already come in. So if you don't mind, I'd love to start weaving some of our audience questions into our conversation. So one that came up is, how do you talk to students that may perceive non-negotiables? How do you convince students that what they may perceive as non-negotiables or to not have non-negotiables, such as having to get a job that's in their own backyard?
How do you convince them when they don't want those non-negotiables? Yep. The question?
Yep.
That's where honesty comes in. We're never going to listen to good advice. I mean, I think we've all had situations, Christine, I'm sure you have, where you give someone the right advice and they just don't take it. So we can try the best that we can. I think if there's someone you really want to convince, or you're noticing a trend like that, I think it's about finding people who've done it that can talk about how it was a good decision. Right? There's nothing better than having somebody say, you know what, I did get a job that was in town, or I did take a job, in an industry that was not my dream, and here's how it turned out. So I think real examples of people who've done it and succeeded and moved on from there is probably the best advice I could give. But I also think, this might be a hard thing to take, but some people just have to learn the hard way. Right. And they're not going to take good advice, and they're going to fail, or they're going to struggle. And sometimes that's okay. I think sometimes we spend a little too much time trying to convince people. So I would do the best we can. I would try to find examples, but I think it's okay sometimes to let people find these things out. I think sometimes that it's the hardest thing to do, but sometimes the best we can.
Certainly. I think sometimes we care so much about our students. Yeah. It's not unlike us as parents, for those that are parents or family members, and not wanting our student or our child to sort of feel pain or have to struggle. But a lot of times that pain and the struggle is part of the learning process for them as well. So I think that's great. What do you do, or what advice would you give folks on how they could support students, or quite frankly, even team members or individuals that might be sort of stuck, or they see themselves as like the perpetual victim, right? How do you help them to take those actionable steps? I believe that was step 3 in your 5 steps. How do you actually get them to take that step?
So again, momentum, I think, is so important. Momentum and accountability. So as I mentioned, I'm a really big fan of like accountability partners and, peer groups. And I think texting is beautiful for this, right? Which is pairing people up or having a little support group or however you want to define it, of people who support each other. And I mentioned that group of people who had been laid off who all did this for each other. I could imagine little pods of people doing this. But I think the idea of momentum is really important in these small steps. I think that a lot of students, and I remember doing this myself, felt like I had to do big, important things to move my career forward. And I try to break it down to, what is the absolute tiniest step that you could take? And again, it's growth mindset, right? I'll tell just a really quick story because it's super embarrassing. I don't know anyone else, but I developed a little bit of a peanut M&M situation during the worst days of lockdown. That was my go-to candy, and I was overdoing it. And I knew I was overdoing it. And I felt crummy. Like I had M&M hangovers in the morning and it was really awful. And I thought, I'm not giving them up, right? But I could probably eat a little less. And so one day I counted how many I was eating, and I'm not going to tell you the real number because I'm too embarrassed. Let's 20. I said, tomorrow I'm going to 18, right? It's a doable, tiny strategy. And so I think if we say to students, not write a resume or call alumni or anything that feels big, say, what is the tiniest thing you think you can handle right now? And I want you to do it. I want you to text me when you do it. And then what's the next thing after that and the next thing after that? And I think it really is that simple. It's not glamorous. It's not going to get you a job tomorrow, but it's going to get you out of your rut. And I think the more we focus on that, the more we can really help people. I'm an example. I've been doing this for 20 years. People are like, how do you build a career? I'm like, I'm not an overnight success, right? I remember I started my business. I worked 5 days a week, then 4 days a week, then 3 days a week, then 2 days, little steps over time make a big difference. And that's not what a 22-year-old, but sometimes it's a choice. Oh, I'm a whole lot of candy discussion in. I'm glad it wasn't me, but yeah, okay. I love you all for not making me. Yes, I love you all. Thank you.
I love that. I love that Candace is actually eating a peanut butter cup as
Candace, you are my people. You are my people.
I support you. I love that analogy. And I love that story, I should say, not an analogy. I love that story because I think it is sometimes so overwhelming to think about the big things we can do that if you can break it down to really those small steps, we can make so much more progress than we think is sort of possible. And I think that's a really beautiful message that you've just sent everyone that I think everyone is actually going to remember and take with them as they sort of move forward. Let's actually sort of, so I want to kind of pivot this a little bit to remain on the topic of sort of career educators. I think one of the things that I felt quite frankly, very adamant about for a long time now, and have been sort of saying fairly consistently, is that in order for us to actually get our students ready for the future of work, we must first shine sort of a mirror on ourselves. Are we agile? Are we nimble? Are we ready to adapt? Are we ready to rethink and reinvent who we are so that we can actually also be a good example to our students in how we prepare them? I'm curious from your standpoint and from all the conversations that you've had with so many different organizations, employers, and institutions, what are a couple of things that you really think career services needs to recalculate on at this particular point in time?
So I'm going to return to baby steps, right? I don't want to say we all need to change everything that we do, right? What are the smallest steps you could take to move forward? And by the way, this is not career services, this is higher ed. I was on another webinar, I don't think it was said yesterday, but somebody said, higher ed is where like innovation higher ed is where glaciers go to relax, right? It's like it's gonna move slowly. That was it. Higher ed is where glaciers go to relax. So higher ed is a slow environment in a lot of ways, but it's also a tremendously innovative environment because you are surrounded by young people. And you all know I obsessively study millennial and Gen Z trends. Well, you are surrounded by them. So where are the small things you can do? And the word that I like to use is curiosity, right? Mm-hmm. You will never get old if you remain curious, right? Yep. The other word I like is, can you be not a millennial, but a perennial? And the example of a perennial that I always give is Lorne Michaels, the producer of Saturday Night Live. He invented that show in the 60s. He does not pretend to be a young person, but he keeps up with what's funny over generations, right? So he is perennially involved in the zeitgeist and the conversation while not trying to act younger and cooler than he is. So where can you be a perennial? By showing curiosity. So for example, one manager I know, and I think anyone in career services could do this, every week he asks his teenage son show me a new app. Show me a new app that I haven't used, right? I just want to see it. And the joke, of course, that he made is one day it was Tinder. And he said, oh my God, oh, it's so embarrassing. But he said, no, you know what? How often in the world today do people talk about swiping left and swiping right?
Yeah.
It's become of the vernacular. If you didn't know it, you're now old fashioned. Maybe that will spark you to think about a career services app where you swipe left and swipe right, because it, so these things build on each other. So are you listening to new music? Are you reading? I sit at the kids' table at Thanksgiving, right? Are you keeping up with what's going on? And what that does is it's these little moments, these little pings that tell you, here's what's going on. Here's what people are doing. I think the worst thing we can do is to kind of go, I want to know. I don't want to change. And by the way, every single person on this call is doing it, because I bet you did not use any technology like this 2 years ago, right? We all pivoted. When we have to, we do. And so where can you find the pockets of innovation? Where can you go to the entrepreneurship club on campus, right? Who is the most innovative person on your campus? Can you go watch them, right? Mm-hmm. So it's sort of surrounding yourself and actively deciding that I'm going to fill my tanks with innovation and change, not because I'm going to do an exact thing with it, but that I want to be part of that dialogue and that conversation. And I think that if your colleagues and your students see you doing that and in those environments, they perceive you in a different way. So try TikTok, I think is the short answer to that. Does that all make sense? There's not one like, oh, if you do this, you will now never be obsolete. If you do a series of things, and we all know people, we all know our colleagues who are doing this. I bet we could all list off the people who are innovative in space. They do and follow that path.
Yep. I love the suggestion you gave around talking to folks that are outside of our profession, talk to folks that don't do what we do. There's so much inspiration that I know I get on a daily basis from reading articles that are outside of my industry, from watching things that are outside of my industry, from asking questions and talking to people that do seemingly very different, and sometimes it would seem unrelated things, but there are principles and there are things that you garner from what they're learning, from their research, from what they're putting together that you might be able to apply in new and different ways. And it keeps your mind fresh. I know this is, I used to tell my teams this, and I actually still do this a little bit. But one of the things that I also try and make sure I do regularly to keep sort of all of my change muscles sort of strong is I will do really small things like making sure I take a different route to work, that I walk a different way, that I change up my morning routine, and I don't just go to the bathroom, brush my teeth, take a shower, then eat breakfast. I'll like change up sort of the order of things. And it's really little things that sometimes I think we just go into autopilot. But when you change that routine or you just mix it up ever so slightly, it does force your mind to have to think about things a little bit differently, or to have to see things that you perhaps didn't see before that could actually be inspirational in the smallest of ways, but could actually lead to something else. So I love that. I think that's super, super helpful. We have a few more questions that have come in from the audience. So I'm going to switch back over to that so that I can ask you about those. I love this question. Can you talk about conversations that you have had with students and professionals about working in a multi-generational and global workforce? After reading The Culture Map by Erin Meyer, I'm wondering about the role of career services and what role they have to play in that aspect of career readiness. And I assume they mean in getting students and professionals ready for the multi-generational workforce.
It's actually sort of astonishing how age segregated we tend to be as a society, right? We tend to, when we're a student, hang out with other students, and people over 50, hang out with people over 50. I think the more we can break down those silos, the better. So college campuses are some of the most multi-generational environments that exist, right? You have tenure professors in their 80s, and then you have, high school students coming in their first day of college. So how do you create more environments where people are in multi-generational situations? So, if you're going to form a committee or a discussion group, make sure it's multi-generational. Invite professors or people of other generations to come in and speak. Mindfully think about your panels and your events having people of different generations represented. So it's sort of education by immersion, right? So if you walk into a company and you've never been on a multi-generational team before, it's going to feel uncomfortable. And frankly, I don't think there's any way to teach someone generational diversity except for being part of it. And we all are somewhat, because we're in families and we understand it. But how many students are on teams with people who are 40 years older than they are? That's going to happen in the workforce. So if there are any ways to mimic that or create that, mentoring, right, with alumni is a really good way to do that. But to create opportunities where people can have those interactions. I know one organization I work with, when they have mentoring, it's not just a conversation between two people, they work on a project together so that you're collaborating with someone of a different generation, not just having an advice conversation, but actually trying to accomplish something. Volunteer events are a great way for people of all abilities, all backgrounds, all ages to work together on a project. So maybe you deliberately create a career services run event with an over 50 organization so that you can partner on volunteering together. So I think it's being mindful, as an element of diversity, just as we would not create an event of all people today, and that would be horrifying, to be mindful of generational difference when we create any activity or panel or discussion, just as we would with other aspects, or hope we would with other aspects of diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as with everything with diversity, there is seen diversity, what we can identify with our eyes, and there's also a wide range of diversity that is unseen, that we also have to keep in mind when we think about diversity of background and of upbringing and of socioeconomic status and so many other elements that we need to keep in mind. I love that you mentioned that, and I love the tangible suggestions of what people might be able to actually put into practice. There's another couple of great questions that have come in from the group, so I'm going to ask those to you as well. One is, can you discuss managing expectations of coaching relationships and setting boundaries as a coach with students? How do you recommend navigating steps in coaching, and how and when should this be communicated?
So I've really come to believe any unwritten rules are inherently unfair. So if my expectation of you, if I'm coaching you and my expectation is you shouldn't email me more than once a week because I think that's right, there's no way for you to know that unless I communicate it. So I think we need to think of transparency as an issue of equity and fairness, which is, I think it's fair. And I think it sometimes feels a little too formal or maybe uncool, but to say, you're entering into this coaching relationship, here are the boundaries, right? Here are the rules of the road. I've heard some people call this a personal user's manual, which is when you work with me as a coach, I'm available between 9 and 5. I am only available by email. I don't text. And, here are the parameters. I think the more we give people boundaries, the more free they feel within them. One example that came up, I was doing a session and there was a residence hall advisor who said that she said to her students, call me anytime. And so people started calling her, students started calling her, where this is going, at 1 a.m., 2 a.m. And she said, I didn't mean anytime. I mean anytime before 11 p.m. Right? So be careful with your words. Be careful with your boundaries. So I think people respect it when you do lay this stuff out. You give a one-sheeter and say, here's how coaching works. I think people are very happy to have rules. And frankly, students are used to that stuff, right? Professors have office hours. And I just think that we want to be nice and we want to be helpful. And so we don't set those rules and we say nice things like call me anytime. But if they're not true, lay out those boundaries.
I love that. Thank you. And that's a great story. You definitely don't want people calling you in the middle of the night. We're going to actually turn back a little bit to passion and privilege and sort of that conversation. This is another question that came in. Your point about passion and privilege is well taken. However, many recruiters and corporate partners I work with expect our students to demonstrate their passion for the industry to which they are applying in their interview. Any tips on how to prepare our students and manage those expectations? And I know I have some thoughts too, but you go first and I'll chime on to what you say.
Yeah, it's a really complicated conversation whenever we talk about privilege. Where I would sort of parse out privilege is, it is a privilege for someone to be able to choose a job based entirely on passion, for example, without having to think about money, right? Or having to pay back loans, or how they're going to get to work because they don't have a car, right? So it sort of assumes that everything else is equal and you can choose on passion. That's how I would kind of parse out why we're talking about privilege related to it. I think the idea of passion is very different. Because to me, you can be passionate or interested in something, but not define it as your dream job, right? Or pursuing your passion. So, I think that you can be knowledgeable and interested and learn to be passionate about a topic. But to me, it's a little bit more nuanced of what I was trying to say was there is not a perfect job like a soulmate, the one who's going to be perfect. And if we pull that away, it gives students a lot more choice and a lot more agency. But I do think that employers absolutely want students to say that they're passionate about working and that they have a strong work ethic and they're excited. But I think they're maybe two different things. What do you think, Christine?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think actually just replace the word passion with interest. And I think it changes the tenor of the conversation. It changes the perspective and the mindset of the conversation. Should a student show interest in a job or an industry that they wish to go into? 100%. You're right. Employers do want to know, why are you interested in me? Are you interested in our mission? Are you interested in the work that we do? Are you interested in the research or the development of what we are looking at in the forefront of where we are headed? Certainly a student would need to express that. They would need to express that interest and that they've done some research into that. Whether or not you're passionate about it, I think is a different sort of threshold. And if we think about passion and interest on a spectrum, I don't think a student has to show passion for a particular job or role, but I do think they should show some level of interest because they've actually done some research around it and they're interested in that. And so that's sort of how I would parse it out, which I think is similar to what you were just talking about as well.
Agreed. And there's some really good conversation in the chat about this as well.
Yes, or use the word committed. That also makes a whole lot of sense. I think that's right. Now, Lindsey, I think when we think about, recalculating in this new world and everything that we're all I know many colleges, many of our colleagues that are on the line right now, they are already starting to plan for sort of return to the office. And I'm really big about actually not using the phrase that I think some people are using, which is return to work, because I would argue everybody's been working for the past year. Everybody's been working, whether you are physically in the office or you are not in the office, everybody's been working. So the conversation right now is not actually returning to work, it's returning to a physical space, potentially, if you are on a campus. And I think as folks sort of think about that, and they think about what recalculating their jobs and their roles, the fact that virtual, quite frankly, is now playing a much bigger role in recruiting, in how employers want to interact, in what students are thinking about, especially underrepresented students. Are there particular things that you would encourage folks to ask for help about? So kind of going back to your 5 stages, is there something that you can already see that's coming up a lot that is related to ask for help? Go ahead. There's no shame in it.
Oh my gosh, I could talk about this topic for an hour and a half, but here's my headline, because this is all I talk about every day. Embrace the gray. There are companies like Twitter and Facebook that are going to let everybody work from wherever they want forever. And there are companies like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan that are never going to let anybody work from home ever. There's a whole lot of nuance in between there. The other thing that I think about a lot is there was a report for the Washington Post who said pandemics start fast and they end slow. And I think remote work started fast and it's going to end slow. So take your time. Don't rush people back, right? I think the companies I most admire and the teams I most admire are taking a little bit of a slower approach. Anybody who wants to come back perhaps is in the first round, anybody whose job, and 50% of our population had to be in the office. So, certainly, a difference of people who even had the privilege to work remotely. But I think this idea that we have to decide everything right now and decide for everybody is a little bit of a false choice, right? Yeah. So give it a little bit of time. Watch how things play out. If you need to have people in, come up with a solution that works for now. But I think the most important piece is just listen to what people are saying. There are a lot of people who want to come back. There are a lot of people who want to come back most of the time. There are a lot of people who want to come back, but they can't come back until they have childcare in September, right? So start to have those conversations. And one of the privileges, or one of the advantages, I should say, of career services often having smaller teams is we can manage the handful of people we have. So I think start to have the dialogue with people and realize that there's a lot of nuance of what's happening that maybe isn't going to be figured out for a little while. We're not at the end of this thing by any means. And I think some people have decided that now we have to make a decision right now. And I wonder if maybe that's not true.
I think there's so much, Lindsey, I just want to call you out for this. Everything that you've said in your answers and how you've thought about the questions that I've asked you, the questions that the audience has asked you, you've literally put so many of your own steps into practice. I can see you being curious. I can see you sort of trying to find the positive, trying to reframe in your mind to that particular situation. I love that, not only because it makes you an enjoyable person to be around, but I think it's such a great example for all of us and for our field as we think through that. I'm curious, how did you personally cultivate, and I'll kind of turn it personal for the last 5 minutes here, how did you personally cultivate that type of mindset? Did you have mentors early on in your career that sort of helped you to begin to practice that mindset? I think so much of what you've talked about today, and what I certainly talk about all the time with change and with mindset, it's all just practice. It's muscle, and it's muscle memory. And the more you do it, the easier it gets, the less foreign it sort of feels. And so I'm curious for you, what jump-started that? Was that just sort of your own upbringing? Was it a mentor or a few mentors that you had that really helped set you on your path and helped you to think in that way? How have you sort of inspired or motivated yourself?
Thank you for those compliments. I love the personal question. I think it's several things, like everything. I think I have a natural interest in talking to people. I mean, I've always been kind of mouthy and talky, and like that's kind of what I enjoy doing is talking to people. I'm the oldest kid in my family of all my 13 cousins, so I got to sit at the grown-up table when I was a kid. So I think I just kind of have a little bit of that innately. But I also think, as someone who started as an entrepreneur early, I didn't have colleagues around me. And so I had to kind of seek that out. So I was a very big fan of professional associations, networking events. I sort of had to make my own colleagues. And I think that kind of forced me to be in that world. For the positive approach, you know, I've been very vocal about this, and I think we have to be in the mental health sort of chaos that we're in. But I've had therapy. I have gone to, you know, I've used any resource available to me to try to be positive. Someone mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy and said I sounded like that. Yeah, because I have a cognitive behavioral therapist. Like that stuff works. And I think seek professional help when you need it. I also think, you know, we talked a little bit about passion, and I always feel a little disingenuous saying don't be passionate about your work. I feel very fortunate that I found work that I am about. And I think you find work that interests you and that you, I enjoy talking about it. So, you know, I like to have these conversations. I like to be part of these dialogues. I like to chit chat with people on LinkedIn. But the positivity is a learned trait. And I think to think that some people are positive and some people aren't does a lot of people a disservice. So I'm really, really, really worried about the mental health of our students today and young people in general. And I try to be very vocal in saying it doesn't come easy. It's something that you have to work on. And I make it a priority to work on it, right? And meet with positive people and eliminate the negative people. So, you know, none of this stuff is easy. I have so much respect for everybody out here. We just went through a global pandemic. Like, this is really hard stuff. And we need to rely on each other. So I hope that's helpful. I'm kind of rambling, but it's a lot of different things all mixed up. And M&Ms and peanut M&Ms help me a lot.
I think it's so helpful. I mean, honestly, I can't thank you enough. And I'm sure there are literally hundreds of people that would agree with me that want to just be grateful to you for your vulnerability. I mean, I think just in that very simple statement that you just gave for the past minute and a half, I mean, I think you've taken some of the stigma away that certainly some of us still feel about mental health, about asking for help, about being able to seek out mentors or people or professionals or friends in our lives that can be honest with us. And I think having those lifelines are so critical to our growth and our development and to being able to get a better sense of sort of who we are. With my very last question, I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to get to their next session on time. I am simply going to ask you, what is one piece of advice that you would give everybody as they head off into the rest of this year, into the second half of 2021? What is one thing that you want them to recalculate?
You should have warned me about this question. Oh gosh, I'm following the chat about return to work, so that's on my mind now. Okay, so here's what I'm going to go with. Although this is really hard, I'm going to rethink it and I want to change my mind. As I mentioned, I was a bit of a talker as a kid. And my grandpa used to always say, Lindsey, listen more than you talk. There's a reason 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them accordingly. I think as leaders, we need to listen. We're not going to like everything we hear. We're not going to like everything our organization decides. We're not going to be able to help every student. But to me, the more I listen and the less I think I know what I'm talking about. I just talked for an hour with you, so I'm probably not really practicing what I preach, but listen more than you talk. And I think the pandemic sort of forced me to go from being a speaker to being a listener. And I think it was a really good pivot. So maybe just today, where can you listen a little bit more than usual? And maybe listen to people that you normally don't listen to, I think is a corollary to that. So that's where I'll end it. But Christine, thank you so much. It's so great to be with you.
Lindsey, that was such a perfect ending to everything that you shared with us. I think listening, and I think that actually the little nugget that you squeezed in there was you're not going to like everything you hear. And that's okay. Instead of getting mad, get curious about that. Ask more questions, try and understand where that comes from. And I love that. So Lindsey, thank you. Thank you for being with us. I'm so glad. I think you can see all the love streaming into the chat for you. We're thrilled to have you and your time and your book. And to all of the attendees, 200 of you will be blessed with her book very, very soon. So thank you and have a great session.